So, in everyday life, we often talk of our rights. As members of a democratic country, we may speak of such rights as the right to vote, the right to form the political parties, and the right to contest the elections, and so on. But apart from the generally accepted political and civil rights, people today are also making new demands for the rights, such as the right to information, right to clean air, or the right to safe drinking water. Rights are claimed not only in the relation to our political and public lives, but also in the relation to our social and personal relationships. Moreover, rights may be claimed not only for adult human beings but also for the children, unborn fetuses, and even unborn fetuses and even animals. The notion of rights is thus invoked in a variety of different ways by the different people. In this chapter, we will explore that. First of all, what do we mean when we speak of our rights? And then उसके बाद जो next step वो है, what is the basis on which rights are claimed and what purpose do rights are serve and why are they so important? What are rights? A right is essentially an entitlement or a justified claim, and it denotes what we are entitled to as citizens, as individuals, and as human beings. It is something that we consider to be due to us, as something that the rest of the societies must recognize as being a legitimate claim that must be upheld. And this does not mean that everything that I regard to be necessary and desirable is a right. I may want to wear the clothes of my choice to the schools rather than the prescribed uniform, and I may want to stay out late at night, but this does not mean that I have a right to dress in any way I like at schools or to return home when I choose to do so. There is a distinction between between what I want and think I am entitled to, and what can be designated as rights. Rights are primarily those claims that along with the others, regard to be necessary for leading a life of respect and dignity. In fact, one of the grounds on which rights have been claimed is that they represent conditions that we collectively see as a source of self-respect and dignity. For example, the rights to livelihood may be considered necessary for leading a life of dignity. Being gainfully employed gives a person economic independence and thus is central for his or her dignity. Having our basic needs met gives us freedom to pursue our talents and interests, or take the right to express ourselves freely. This right gives us the opportunity to be creative and original, whether it be in writing or dance or music or any other creative activity. But freedom of expression is also important for democratic government, since it allows for the free expressions of beliefs and opinions. Rights such as the right to a livelihood or freedom of expression would be important for all human beings who live in the society, and they are described as universal in the nature. Another ground on which rights have been claimed is that they are necessary for our well-being. They help individuals to develop their talents and skills. A right like the right to education, for instance, helps to develop our capacity to reason, gives us useful skills, and enables us to make informed choices in the life. It is in this sense that education can be designated as a universal right. However, if an activity is injurious to our health and well-being, it cannot be claimed as a right. For instance, since medical research has shown that prohibited drugs are injurious to one's health, and since they affect our relations with the others, we cannot insist that we have a right to inhale or inject drugs or smoke tobacco. In the case of smoking, it may even be injurious to the health of people who may be around the smoker. Drugs may not only injure our health, but they may also sometimes change our behavior patterns and make us a danger to other people. In terms of our definition of right, smoking or taking banned drugs cannot be claimed as a right. Here, let's go through the recent newspapers and make a list of people's movement that have made proposals for the new kinds of rights. Now, next is, where do rights come from? In the 17th and 18th centuries, political theorists argued that rights are given to us by the nature or God. The rights of man were derived from the natural law. This means that the rights were not conferred by a ruler or a society. Rather, we are born with them. As such, these rights are inalienable and no one can take these away from us. They identified three natural rights of man: the right to life, liberty, and property. All other rights were said to be derived from these basic rights, and the idea that we are born with the certain rights, it is a very powerful notion because it implies that no state or organization should take away what has been given by the law of nature. And this conception of natural rights has been used widely to oppose the exercise of arbitrary power by the states and governments and to safeguard the individual freedom. Uske baad, in recent years, the term human rights is being used more than the term natural rights, and this is because the idea of there being a natural law or a set of norms that are laid down by us by the nature or God appears unacceptable today. Rights are increasingly seen as the guarantees that human beings themselves seek or arrive in them order to lead a minimally good life. The assumption behind human rights is that all persons are entitled to certain things simply because they are human beings. As a human being, each person is unique and equally valuable, and this means that all persons are equal and no one is born to serve the others. उसके बाद जो next है वो क्या है यहाँ पे? Can't own the human dignity. Everything has either a price or a dignity. What has a price is such that something else can also be put in space as its equivalent. By contrast, that which is elevated above all the price and admits no equivalent has a dignity. Human beings, unlike all other objects, possess dignity. They are for this reason valuable in themselves. For the 18th century German philosopher Immanuel Kant, this simple idea had a deep meaning. It meant that every person has dignity and ought to be so treated by virtue of being a human being. A person may be uneducated, poor, or powerless. He may even be dishonest or immoral, yet he remains a human being and deserves to be given some minimum dignity. For Kant to treat the people with dignity wants to treat them morally, and this idea became a rallying point for those struggling against social hierarchies and for the human rights. Kant's views represent what is called the moral conception of rights, and this position rests upon two arguments. And first, we should be treating others as we would like to be treated ourselves. Second, we should make sure that we don't treat the other person as means to our ends, and we should not treat people as we treat a pen, a car, or a horse. That we should respect people not because they are useful to us but because they are often all human beings, and each of us possesses an intrinsic value. Hence, we must have equal opportunities to be free and realize our full potential. And this conception of a free and equal self is increasing, being used to challenge existing inequalities based on race, caste, religion, and gender. Today, the UN Universal Declaration of Human Rights builds upon this understanding of rights, and it attempts to recognize those claims that the world community collectively sees as being important for leading a life of dignity and self-respect. The notion of universal human rights has been used by the oppressed people all over the world to challenge laws which segregate them and deny them equal opportunities and rights. In fact, it is through the struggles of groups that have felt excluded that the interpretation of existing rights has sometimes been altered. Slavery has, for instance, been abolished, but there are other struggles that have only had a limited success. Even today, there are communities struggling to define humanity in a way which includes them. The list of human rights which people have claimed has expanded over the years as societies face new threats and challenges. For the instance, we are very conscious today of the need to protect the natural environment, and this has generated demands for the rights to clean air, water, sustainable development, and the like. A new awareness about the changes which many people, especially women, children, or the sick face in the times of war or natural crisis has also led to the demands for a right to livelihood, right of children, and the like. Such claims express a sense of moral outrage about the infringements of people's dignity, and they also act as a rallying call to people to try and extend rights to all the human beings. We should not underestimate the extent and power of such claims. They often invoke wide support. You may have heard about the pop star Bob Geldof's recent appeal to the Western governments to end poverty in Africa, and seen TV reports about the scale of support which he received from ordinary people. Here you can see my father had applied for a telephone connection. It's been over 2 months and he still has not got it. What can he do? You know what? Now we have a right to information. We can find out the status of his application as well as the cause for the delay. And then उसके बाद जो नेक्स्ट यहाँ पे क्या है, लीगल राइट्स एंड द स्टेट. While claims for the human rights appeal to our moral self, the degree of success of such appeals depend on the number of factors, most important of which is the support of governments and the law. And this is why so much importance is placed on the legal recognition of the rights. A Bill of Rights is enshrined in the constitutions of many countries, and constitutions represent the highest law of the land, and so constitutional recognition of certain rights gives them a primary importance. In our country, we call them fundamental rights. Other laws and policies are supposed to respect the rights granted in the constitution, and the rights mentioned in the constitution would be those which are considered to be of the basic importance, and in some cases these may be supplemented by the claims which gain importance because of the particular history and customs of a country. In India, for instance, we have a provision to ban untouchability, which draws attention to a traditional social practice in the country. So important is the legal and constitutional recognition of our claims that several theorists define rights as claims that are recognized by the state. And the legal endorsement certainly gives our right to a special status in the society, but it is not the basis on which rights are claimed, as we discussed earlier. Rights have steadily been expanded and reinterpreted to include previously excluded groups and to reflect our contemporary understanding of what it means to lead a life of dignity and respect. However, in most cases, the claimed rights are directed towards the state. That is, through these rights, people make demands upon the state. When I assert my right to education, I call upon the state to make provisions for my basic education. Society may also accept the importance of education and contribute to it on its own. Different groups may open schools and fund scholarships so that children of all the classes can get the benefit of education. But the primary responsibility rests upon the state. It is the state that must initiate necessary steps to ensure that my right to education is fulfilled. Thus, rights placed an obligation upon the state to act in the certain kinds of ways. Each right indicates what the state must do as well as what it must not do. For instance, my rights to life obliges the state to make laws that protect me from the injury by the others. It calls upon the state to punish those who hurt me or harm me. If a society feels that the right to life means a right to a good quality of life, it expects the state to pursue the policies that provide for the clean environment along with the other conditions that may be necessary for a healthy life. In other words, my right here places certain obligations upon the state to act in a certain way. Rights not only indicate what the state must do, they also suggest what the state must refrain from doing. My right to liberty as a person, for instance, suggests that the state cannot simply arrest me at its own will. If it wishes to put me behind bars, it must defend that action. It must give reasons for curtailing my liberty before a judicial court. This is why the police are required to produce an arrest warrant before taking me away. My rights thus place certain constraints upon the state actions. And then उसके बाद जो next है वो क्या है? To put it in another way, our rights ensure that the authority of the state is exercised without violating the sanctity of individuals' life and liberty. The state may be the sovereign authority, and the laws it makes may be enforced with the force. But the sovereign state exists not for its own sake, but for the sake of the individual. It is people who matter more, and it is their well-being that must be pursued by the government in the power. And the rulers are accountable for their actions and must not forget that laws exist to ensure the good of the people. Here, go through the newspaper of the last few days and identify cases of rights violations which have been discussed. What should the government and civil society do to prevent the such violations? Kinds of rights में क्या है? Most democracies today begin by drawing up a charter of political rights. Political rights give to the citizens the right to equality before law and the right to participate in the political processes. फिर उसके बाद है, दे इंक्लूड सच राइट्स एज द राइट टू वोट एंड इलेक्ट रिप्रेजेंटेटिव्स एंड द राइट टू contest the elections and the right to form the political parties or join them. Political rights are supplemented by the civil liberties, and the latter refers to the right to a free and fair trial and the right to express one's views freely and the right to protest and express dissent. Collectively, civil liberties and political rights form the basis of a democratic system of the government, but as was mentioned before, rights aim to protect the well-being of the individual. Political rights contribute to it by making the government accountable to the people, by giving greater importance to the concern of the individuals over that of the ruler, and by ensuring that all persons have an opportunity to influence the decisions of the government. However, our rights of political participation can only be exercised fully when our basic needs of the food, shelter, clothing, health are met. For a person living on the pavement and struggling to meet these basic needs, political rights by themselves have little value. They require certain facilities like an adequate ways to meet their basic needs and reasonable conditions of work. Hence, democratic societies are beginning to recognize these obligations and providing economic rights. In some countries, citizens, particularly those with the low incomes, receive housing and medical facilities from the state. In others, unemployed persons receive certain minimum wage so that they can meet their basic needs. In India, the government has recently introduced a rural employment guarantee scheme, among other measures to help the poor. Today, in addition to political and economic economic rights, more and more democracies are recognizing the cultural claims of their citizens. The right to have primary education in one's mother tongue, the right to establish institutions for teaching one's language and culture are today recognized as being necessary for the leading a good life. And the list of rights has thus steadily increased in democracies, while some rights, primarily the right to life, liberty, equal treatment, and the right to political participation, are seen as a basic rights that must receive priority. Other conditions that are necessary for the leading a decent life are being recognized as justified claims or rights. Let's debate. The right to culture means that no one should be allowed to make films that offend the religious or cultural beliefs of the others. Let's think which of the following rights granted to groups or communities are justifiable. Discuss. Jain community in a town sets up its own school and enrolls students only from its own community. Purchase of the land or property in Himachal Pradesh is restricted to those who are residents in that state. And the principal of co-ed college issued a circular that no girl should wear any western dress. A panchayat in Haryana decided that the boys and the girl from the different castes who married each other will not be allowed to live in the village. उसके बाद जो नेक्स्ट है हम डिस्कस करेंगे राइट्स एंड रिस्पॉन्सिबिलिटीज़ के बारे में. So here we are discussing rights and responsibilities. Right not only place obligations upon the state to act in a certain way, for instance, to ensure sustainable development, but they also place obligations upon each of us. Firstly, they compel us to think not just of our own personal needs and interests, but to defend some things as being good for all of us. Protecting the ozone layer, minimizing air and water pollution, maintaining the green cover by the maintaining the ecological balance. देखो, green cover by planting new trees and preventing cutting down of forests, maintaining the ecological balance are things that are essential for all of us, and they represent the common good that we must act to protect for ourselves as well as for the future generations who are entitled to inherit a safe and clean world, without which they cannot lead a reasonably good life here. Did you see the latest sting operation on the TV yesterday? I couldn't believe the conversation between the host, hot official and the famous actress. That was cheap sensationalism. Besides, it was an infringement of their right to privacy. Here, secondly, they require that I respect the rights of others. If I say that I must be given the right to express my views, I must also grant the same right to others. If I do not want others to interfere in choices I make, the dress I wear, or the music I listen to, I must refrain from interfering in the choices that others make. I must leave them free to choose their music and clothes. I cannot use the right to free speech to incite a crowd to kill my neighbor. In exercising my rights, I cannot deprive others of their rights. My rights are, in the other words, limited by the principle of equal and same rights for all. Thirdly, we must balance our rights when they come into conflict. For instance, my rights to freedom of expression allows me to take pictures. However, if I take pictures of a person bathing in his house without his consent and post them on the internet, that would be a violation of his rights to privacy. फिर इसके बाद जो नेक्स्ट है वो क्या है? Yes, so I was telling fourthly, citizens must be vigilant about the limitations which may be placed on their rights. A currently debated topic concerns the increased restrictions which many governments are imposing on the civil liberties of the citizens on the grounds of national security. Protecting national security may be defended as necessary for safeguarding the rights and well-being of citizens. But at what point could the restrictions imposed as necessary for security themselves become a threat to the rights of the people? Should a country facing the threat of terrorists bombing be allowed to curtail the liberty of citizens? Should it be allowed to arrest the people on the mere suspicion? And should it be allowed to intercept their mall or tap their phones? Should it be allowed to use torture to extract the confession? In such situations, the question to ask is whether the person concerned poses an imminent threat to society. If an arrested person should be allowed legal counsel and the opportunity to present their case before a magistrate or a court of law. We need to be extremely cautious about the giving governments powers which could be used to curtail the civil liberties of individuals, or such powers can be misused. Governments can become authoritarian and undermine the very reasons for which governments exist, namely the well-being of the members of the state. Hence, even though rights can never be absolute, we need to be vigilant in protecting our rights and those of the others, for they form the basis of a democratic society. On 10 December 1948, the General Assembly of the United Nations adopted and proclaimed the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Following this historic act, the Assembly called upon all the members countries to publicize the text of the declaration and to cause to be disseminated, displayed, read and expounded principally in schools and other educational institutions without distinction based on the political status of the countries or territories. Now, preamble. Whereas recognition of the inherent dignity and of the equal and inalienable rights of all the members of the human family is the foundation of freedoms, justice and peace in the world, whereas disregard and contempt for the human rights have resulted in barbarous acts which have outraged the conscience of mankind, and the advent of a world in which human beings shall enjoy freedom of speech and belief and freedom from the fear and want has been proclaimed as the highest aspiration of the common people, whereas it is an essential if man is not to be compelled to have recourse as a last resort to rebellion against tyranny and oppression, that human rights should be protected by the rule of law, whereas it is essential to promote the development of friendly relations between nations, whereas the peoples of the United Nations have the Charter reaffirmed their faith in the fundamental human rights, in the dignity and worth of the human person, and in the equal rights of man and women, and have determined to promote the social progress and better standards of life in the larger freedom, whereas member states have pledged themselves to achieve in the cooperation with the United Nations the promotion of universal respect for and observance of the human rights and fundamental freedoms, whereas a common understanding of these rights and freedoms is of the greatest importance for the full realization of this pledge. And now, therefore, the General Assembly proclaims this Universal Declaration of Human Rights as a common standard of achievement for all the peoples and all the nations, to the end that every individual and every organ of the society, keeping this declaration constantly in mind, shall strive by teaching and education to promote respect for these rights and freedoms, and by progressive measures, national and international, to secure their universal and effective recognition and observance both among the peoples of member states themselves and among the peoples of territories under their jurisdiction. So this chapter is over. In the next chapter, we will be discussing about the citizenships. Thank you so much for watching and stay connected.